Kalispera sas, que kalasorisate, bonsoir, bienvenue, good evening and welcome. I'm Jonathan Tomlinson, the Assistant Director of the Institute, and I have the pleasure of introducing tonight's speaker, Dr. Emily Varto. Emily holds a BA in Classical Studies from Queen's University, an MA in Classics from Dalhousie University, and a PhD also in Classics from the University of British Columbia with a thesis entitled Early Greek Kinship. Emily is currently Associate Professor in the Department of Classics at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, where she has been teaching since 2009. She also sits on our Institute's Board of Directors as representative for Dalhousie and is also the Secretary to the board. Emily is currently working on not one but two monographs: The Politics of Fatness in Archaic Greek Poetry and Art, and, for Routledge, Classics and Cultural Anthropology. This evening she will give a lecture entitled Jane Ellen Harrison and the Winnowing Fan, a foray into early ethnographic classics. Emily.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here in this space. So I'm just going to launch in the interests of time and mulled wine. So this is part of that second book project that Jonathan mentioned on classics and cultural anthropology. And in this book, I'm trying to write in a very short amount of space, maximum 40,000 words or so, some of the history of classics and anthropology, the intersections of the two disciplines. And one of the key intersections I continually come across is that of the so-called Cambridge ritualists and anthropology. And so I decided to take a foray into what exactly was going on with the Cambridge ritualists by way of looking at Jane Ellen Harrison, who is largely known as the central figure of these ritualists, or the ritualist school, and look at her work on the Winnowing fan. It's not her most influential work, it's not her most, perhaps, longest work or most involved, but I think it's a really good example of what Harrison was up to around the turn of the century, around 1900, which is a really key period for her, and we'll come to that in time. So I'm going to start with a little bit of anthropology first. I'll try to make the theory as palatable and as understandable as possible. So in 1960, published in 1961, the American anthropologist Clyde Kluckhohn, he put together an address on classics and anthropology. And so this is kind of the state of things in 1960. He gives a bit of a historical run-up to it. And one of the big questions in 1960 and the 1950s even was what happened to the relationship between classics and anthropology. There was a noticeable drop-off, split, I've called it a divorce between the two disciplines that had been very much joined through the end of the 19th century. Something happens around 1900 through to 1920 where the two disciplines take a serious departure from one another. And so here we see some of Clyde Kluckhohn's reasoning for this. Right? So he says, the classicists were stuck in the old anthropology. Well, the anthropologists had moved on. They moved in a new direction. And he defines the old anthropology that the classicists were stuck in as Fraserian, named after James George Fraser, who many of you may have encountered through The Golden Bough. And so he labels it Fraserian. It's largely comparative, it's evolutionary, making direct comparisons between different peoples and then setting them into a social evolutionary scheme from, primitive through savage, through barbarian, through to civilized. And so it was a kind of anthropology that was very much focused on origins, survival, stages. And so this is what had been going on in the late 19th century. But anthropologists moved on, he said, and the classicists just stayed the course. And here you kind of notice it's a little bit damning here. And this given that he was he was actually a student of classics. He had studied the classics. He had advanced degrees in it, as well as in anthropology. So he was actually in a pretty good position to make an assessment. And we're going to come across the figure of Gilbert Murray, who was one of the Cambridge ritualists. He was actually a student, or Cluacoin was actually a student of Murray's at one point at Oxford. So he's got a pretty good view on this. And so he basically says, it's a little bit damning, right? Turning now to the application of the new anthropology to the data of Grecian antiquity, there's little choice among the anthropologists. The anthropologists started ignoring what was going on in the class. They had no more interest in it because they were doing this new archaeology. And this new archaeology, as of 1960, was very much Cluacoin's own version. His own kind of 1960s, 1950s version, which is very much concerned with patterns within cultures, rather than, looking at, there's something similar here, well, they must be the same sorts of people, right? They worship multiple gods, that other people worship multiple gods, they must be in the same stage of evolution. Well, that was the old style. The new style, instead of looking at what they called content of the culture, if you find a story that's similar between two cultures, right, that's the content. Organization, they have kings, they also have kings, right? That's the old style. Now they're looking at the relationships between all of those things, right? And that's where the new anthropology was going. And classics didn't go with it, right? Not until we get to the mid-1950s, and arguably really not taking hold until the 70s. Even in the late 70s, things were still pretty dicey for a modern anthropology within classics. So this is just a bit of Cluacoin's new. So this is his accounting for what happened. Doesn't quite say why this happened, though. Humphreys, who is very often the voice of anthropology and classics, at least through the 70s and 80s, situated things a little bit differently for this split. She claimed it was new data coming in on both sides. Right? And you look for the classicists here, right? They have excavations at Troy and Mycenae, discovery of Minoan Crete, right? Kind of this, there's all this new material, the old models are no longer working, let's focus in. Right? This is her argument. And at the same time, the anthropologists were really getting into field work, right? Intensive field work in individual communities. And it was not very comparative work. It wasn't comparative at all. They started losing those models. So that they didn't want to compare these peoples, at least not until they developed patterns, and then they could compare the patterns with each other, as Cluacoin has. So this is what Humphreys kind of claims, is that, that they both got into their own fields and dove deep into them, and then they no longer communicated. Humphreys has a lot that's very useful to say on classics and anthropology, but I'm not sure she's quite correct here, and I'm going to hopefully show you that this evening. When we look at exactly the impact of archaeology in the late 19th into the early 20th century, the impact that that's going to have on classics and its actual turn towards anthropology. So I'm just going to ask you to hold on to that idea, and we'll revisit it. So there's some useful things here. The field work, that's going to come up as well, right? What happens when anthropologists begin to do different sorts of things? They're no longer in their armchairs, so they're no longer reaching for their, Greek histories and Roman histories, right? They are in the field. In Papua New Guinea, they're in the Torres Straits, they're in North America amongst the indigenous peoples. Kirk has a slightly different angle on this split. Don't worry, we're getting to the end of these big long quotes. We'll get some pictures soon. He kind of likes the Cambridge ritualists. I kind of do too. This plucky little school out of Cambridge. Disadvantaged coming out of Cambridge in the early 20th century, I'm sure. They're applying novel intuitions of the French sociologist to the cross-cultural data supplied by Fraser and the new ethnography, right? That new ethnography, that's the same stuff that Humphreys is saying drove them apart, right? So this gets me wondering, what is the role of ethnography here, right? Are the Cambridge ritualists somehow different in their use of ethnography? What does that ethnography look like? Does it look like the kind of stuff we're getting out of this new field work, coming out of the new sorts of anthropology? So this is kind of my question. This is one of the reasons why I'm looking at the ethnography and why this is a foray into ethnographic classics in this period. So a little bit about the Cambridge ritualists here, just to give you a little bit of a lowdown. I'm not going to labor this point here. Often you'll see Cambridge ritualists or ritualists in the scare quotes. That's because they're not so much an organized school. They're not, they never called themselves ritualists, right? Instead, they were a group of friends. They're a group of academic colleagues. They went to seminars together. They had tea and dinner, and they met informally and formally. They shared each other's work. They contributed to each other's projects. So it was very much an informal academic group. Harrison tended to be the kind of leading figure, and you see her here seated rather regally, and she seemed to really relish that role. The other members were younger than her, and she exerted quite an influence over them. This picture is not quite all the ritualists. It's two of them in Harrison. The other one is, that's Hugh Stewart. He was another close acquaintance and friend. She had many scholarly friends, as we'll see. So a little bit here about why they're called the ritualists. Not because they themselves did this. That wasn't until the 60s, the 1960s, that they got this label through historians of the discipline. Instead, they're what seems to really connect them is an interest in the so-called primitive, the primitive elements, the deep, dark, weird, bloody, strange elements of antiquity. And the belief that those things are important as any idea of rational antiquity. They particularly focused on the importance of ritual, on ritual action, and then seeing in those ritual actions of antiquity, a lot of which are pretty strange, right? Seeing some what they called holdovers from earlier primitive periods. And the reason why we call them ritualists is because of that focus on ritual, but also because as part of that focus, a part of this idea of the primitive nature of ritual, is that they believe that ritual predated mythology, comes before the stories, and that to understand to understand the myth, you have to go down through the ritual, right? To understand Greek religion, you don't turn to the myth. You turn to the ritual. You turn to the actions, the doing of things, not the saying of things or the thinking of things. And and Harrison puts it rather plainly. I'll zoom ahead at some point and we'll come across it, that she believed that mythology developed, the stories developed in order to explain ritual action that nobody understood anymore, right? I don't know why we do this thing. but we don't want to stop doing it, because if we stop doing it, maybe something bad will happen. But why do we do it? Oh, well, let's tell a story, right? It's that kind of, it's kind of a simplistic explanation, but that's largely the way they're thinking. So within the ritualists, you get, again, this focus on the weirdness, the primitiveness, the strangeness, what they sometimes call the irrationality of antiquity, and the primacy of ritual over myth. So this obviously didn't sit terribly well with a lot of classicists. Some dove right in. It wasn't their own invention. It wasn't Harrison's invention. There were other thinkers at the time who put forward similar theories. But there was, of course, kind of a knee-jerk reaction from some classicists who thoroughly believed that, the world of Greek antiquity was serenely rational, right? This world of Plato and Socrates that is full of rational thought and rational action. Harrison's antiquity was anything but, right? So there was a reaction to that. We'll look at some of it maybe towards the end. But this is one of the reasons why the ritualists often are placed in this dividing point, at this crux, right, where anthropology and classics divide. And I think Finlay, oh gosh, I love quoting Finlay. He's always at his most Finlay when he's talking about history of the discipline. If you ever see me laughing out loud in the library, it's probably at Finlay. Something Finlay said. He's full of snark. And you see a little bit of it here. So my point is both methodological and historical. When Jane Harrison was wrong, and she certainly was in her insistence on the ritual foundation of all myths, that was because she mishandled the Greek evidence. Not because she had spent long hours reading the tedious doings of savages, right? So that, according to Finlay, that's not why, she and the other ritualists are to blame for this split with anthropology, right? But it has to do, she did a bad job of it. She did a hash job, right? And so, right, the hostility engendered by the legendary Cambridge school, the ritualists, hostility that stemmed from bad reasoning and strong emotion, was a powerful contributory factor, if not the cause of an almost total cessation in the dialogue between anthropology and the classics. They had done such a bad job of it that classicists just walked away from anthropology altogether. Now, we could just say this is Moses Finlay, being, kind of exaggerating things, but, that this kind of damnation has stuck. Right? A lot of people, ritualism, right? We kind of back away, get a little bit like, ooh, right? So I really kind of want to see, what is their role? What is their role in this, this split, right? Can we lay this split in part, at the feet of the ritualists and Harrison? So now we get to winnowing, and here's some pictures. All right, so we're going to start in Cambridge in 1903 at Witchfield House. And Witchfield House is the home of Francis Darwin. Francis Darwin, the son of Charles Darwin, the famous Charles Darwin. And the family had a rather large piece of property in Cambridge. Charles lived on one part of it, his mother on another part, and his brother on another part of it. And his house was at Witchfield. And in the early part, let me just get my notes here. There we go. Yep, okay. So in the early part of the 20th century, it's either autumn or early spring. There's no leaves on the trees. This is a modern picture, but the scene, imagine no leaves on the trees. The house is Witchfield, belongs to Francis Darwin. He's a lecturer at botany. He's son of Charles Darwin. And there's a group of Cambridge scholars gathered on his lawn. And they are watching this guy, this old gardener. I think his name is William Bourne. This is results of my poking around various bits of Cambridge demographic information. He was his mother's gardener, but the gardens were all joined, so I'm pretty sure it was this man, William Bourne. So these scholars are gathered around this old farmer using an antique agricultural implement. It's a winnowing fan. This is what a winnowing fan is. It is not a fan that moves air. It is a basket that separates the wheat from the chaff, right? So separating the unwanted parts from the wanted parts, right? So that's what it is to winnow, in case you wanted to know what winnowing was. To winnow is to separate the wheat from the chaff. And so he's using this, and then the Cambridge scholars decide to give it a try. And apparently they all fail miserably, right? They don't know how to winnow. It's a difficult sort of thing to do. So it's a pretty charming scene. I kind of like this story. And it's one that shows up in a lot of biographies of Jane Harrison, partly because it's rather interesting and rather kind of sweet in a way. But it's also an important story for what it tells us about Jane's method and the influence of her colleagues. And it's also going to give us some clues into ethnography and her idea of what classics was in this period. So this is Jane Ellen Harrison here around 1900. She's about 50 when these events are taking place, and she is around 50 when her career in Greek religion takes off, which is its own kind of interesting biographical point. She publishes several works on the winnowing fan that we'll be talking about, the longest of which was published in the Journal of Hellenic Studies in 1903. So that's the one we're largely going to be looking at. So I mentioned at the top of this that this wasn't a particularly, maybe not the most riveting of her works, maybe not the one that made the biggest splash, but it's interesting for capturing her method at this time. And it's kind of funny, actually, that people also thought it was a little bit weird to be studying this particular fan. This is a little poem that Francis Darwin's son wrote about Jane's research. There's something like 8 or 9 stanzas to this. You can find it in Robinson's 2002 work on Harrison, which is excellent. So you can find the whole thing. It was handwritten and found amongst her letters. And you kind of get a sense of, it's this weird lady studying these weird, winnowing instruments from antiquity, right? And you kind of get a sense of that, right? Oh, to think that she might shed a new light on the rise and fall of the Gracchi. But she prefers to explore that insoluble bore called the mystica vannus Iacchi, right? So this is the mystical winnowing fan of Iacchus. So these are little bits of the story that come from her memoirs. She is very clever in writing her memoirs. We can't take them strictly biographically. She's picking and choosing, and we have to treat it with a literary eye. But I particularly enjoyed this passage here, right? So she's working on her article on this winnowing fan that she finds referenced in the Georgics of Virgil, right? Some Latin poetry. And she's writing about it as a ritual instrument. And then Francis Darwin comes along. She calls him Frank. Frank Darwin comes along. "What is a vannus?" he asked. "Oh, a fan," I said. "It was a mystical object used in ceremonies of initiation." "Yes, but Virgil says it is an agricultural implement. Have you ever seen one?" "No," I confessed. "And you are writing about a thing you have never seen," groaned my friend. "Oh, you classical people." I rather love it. There's, the son of Charles Darwin kind of schooling you on not knowing your stuff. Right? So he goes and he gets her an antique winnowing fan. He gets it from France, has it shipped over to Cambridge, and that's the one they use on the lawn and try to figure out how it works. So there they are experimenting with their ethnography in a way. Right? And then, 3 months later, she writes, "I dispatched a paper to the Hellenic Journal, the JHS, on what I had seen and did understand. It was a lifelong lesson to me. It's not quite all my fault. I had been reared in a school that thought it was far more important to parse a word than to understand it. She goes on to complain about subjunctives in the Latin poetry, that's what her teacher was concerned with subjunctives, right? Not what even is this fan and why is it mystical, right? So she paints a certain picture here of what classics looks like around 1900. Right? You kind of get this image that it's all philological, that it's grammatical, more concerned for subjunctives than anything else. But I think we have to watch out for Harrison here. She can be tricky this way. If we take her at her word, we might imagine, they're all just sitting around Cambridge talking about subjunctives constantly. They weren't. So this is part of her context. So part of what I want to do here is look at her ethnographic classics in the context of classics and classical archaeology at the time. One of the ways to do this is to look at how they were schooling, right? And wonderfully, the data has been looked at, has been written about. Mary Beard actually has a nice chapter on this and an edited volume on the training of students in classics at Cambridge. And I focus again on Cambridge because this was where Harrison was based. Now, one of the things to note is that there were many classicists and classical archaeologists who were writing about a whole breadth of things, not just philological. Their questions may have involved looking at texts and language for evidence, but their questions went beyond the text, right? And we can see this going back all the way to George Grote, a very famous English historian of Greek history who wrote in the 1830s. So this isn't, it's not quite fair to say that, everybody's staring at subjunctives only, right? But when you look at how students were being trained, I'm just going to show you a bit of a change happening here. So the classical tripos, those are the exams you have to write to get your undergraduate degree at Cambridge in a particular discipline. And so the classical tripos in 1892 looked like this. They had a series of reforms in 1892. Part 1 was mandatory for anybody who wanted an undergraduate degree, and Part 2 was optional, and you could kind of pick and choose from Part 2. Now, I do have to remind you, not anyone, women were welcome to take these exams, but they were never granted their degrees. They actually weren't granted degrees until 1948 at Cambridge, so you could do all the work and get none of the degree. So this was the world Harrison was working in, which I think is significant, but don't have a lot of time to get into it here. So you would pass your Part 1, and then you could take a section of Part 2, complete 1 or 2 parts. And you'll look, Part 1 is very, very language focused, right? Greek and Roman history, including literature and antiquities, right? So parts, the top part, second part, fourth part, right? Those are all language study, right? The third part, that's everything else. I'll just cobble that all together, right? And then you can walk away with your degree. Now this partly matches, the purpose of a classical education in this period. A lot of it was, training for people to enter other careers, not necessarily training classicists who will be researchers. A couple other things to note. Over on Part 2, we still have a lot of language, it's still very language heavy, and archaeology is in with religion, myth, and domestic life. It's in there with painting, minor arts, and inscriptions. Again, it's a bit of a catch-all there. But isn't that interesting that archaeology and religion and myth come together? This is the world that's producing Jane Harrison and the ritualists. But let's have a look at what's happening in 1903. There was a series of reforms. Now, all of this was debated, often very heatedly, but this eventually is what passed. Have a look at what happens to Part 1. It expands, but we start, there's still a lot of text, there's still a lot of language, but now we have essays on Greek and Roman art, literature, history, right? We have philosophy, right? Now you have some translation about these sorts of things. There's your grammar and syntax, right? So it's expanding what the idea of training for a classics undergraduate is. Right? Over in part 2, archaeology is still that kind of conglomerated thing. Interestingly, Harrison would become the director of that section in archaeology and religion and myth, etc. So, the reason I'm showing you this is to show that, classics in this period was not so wholly philologically focused. It was changing, and the training of students was changing to match the interests, the research interests of the professors, which were more varied. Right? One thing to note here, because we're moving on to Greek archaeology, there's an extra Y there. Archaeology was still studying the things. It wasn't yet the in the field kind of training. That's basically where you got the training, was in the field, not the know-how in the classroom. So if we remember back to what was happening, or what Humphrey says about the discoveries of Mycenae and Troy and the Minoan discoveries, right? That is part of what pushed the disciplines apart. Instead, what we see, I think, is actually a lot of those who were interested in these early periods that were being uncovered actually turned to anthropology to try to understand what they were seeing. That was actually the dominant force. And you can see that even in Evans, who excavated at Knossos. You can see that in Harrison. You can see it in one of Harrison's teachers, Ridgway, whose work we'll have a quick look at in a moment. But just to kind of understand the context, around 1900 was an extremely fruitful period for Greek archaeology. Right? What we now know as, the Greek Bronze Age, the Aegean Bronze Age, was exploding, right? It was all being uncovered moment to moment. The same year that Harrison publishes her work on this mystical fan we see in the Journal of Hellenic Studies, Evans, publishing finds from Knossos, right? So it was that fresh, right? It was that hot. And this had a big impact on pretty much all of classics, because it was turning over what they understood about Greek history entirely, and it either had to be shoehorned in or had to blow up the whole system, and there were different ways of managing that. Couple of important events for Harrison's work. One is the French excavations at Delphi. Right? This was a big one. This is one of those big digs, and it certainly was massive. They moved a whole village out of the way to be able to excavate at Delphi, and we see some of the works here. And what she has to say about this is rather interesting. They were uncovering the stuff of Greek religion, right? Delphi, an epicenter of Greek religion. Right? And now they were uncovering it. And it wasn't just the monuments, it wasn't just the big famous artworks, it was all kinds of stuff. So I chose a couple of images here from the collection from the French school. You can see here's a nice little archaic kouros just popping out of the hillside. Right? Over here we have some of the workmen posing with another kouros coming out. Up top, we have a whole bunch of statue bases and fragments of columns, right? They also found all kinds of votive offerings, all those little bits and pieces that now when we go into the museums we're used to seeing. But that really hadn't been the case. It had been the big, great monuments and artworks. And so all of this material was so important. It inspired the study of Greek religion. Right? So Harrison writes in a book in 1905, "We discover and study not only the Hermes and Praxiteles, but masses of terracottas and bronzes showing the local type under which the god or goddess was worshipped." This is an introduction to kind of her basic introduction to Greek religion, written for more everyday people, right? And she's positively gushing about, you can feel it on the page. She's so excited about what's happening in archaeology and its, what it means for studying Greek religion. So she totally understood what this could mean. And then, of course, we have the opening up of Minoan archaeology. And Harrison herself was actually well acquainted with many of the people involved. We have, of course, Knossos. We have, number of individuals associated with the British school excavating at Knossos. We have Harriet Boyd Hawes, who's at Gornia. We have Bosanquet. We'll learn a little more about him tonight, excavating a number of places on Crete, right? All around 1900 and the years just after, right when Harrison's getting going on her ritual theories and her ideas of Greek religion. We also have the excavations from the British school at Milos, right? So this wild uncovering of this people that sometimes hard for us to imagine, I think, right? That is this people with a strange iconography that doesn't match all the other things that were going on, right? How do we make sense of this? Where do they fit, right? They have a script, right? So who were these people with all their octopus imagery and their their vines and their lotus motifs, right? Thrones emerging at Knossos. So they're really trying to make sense of what was going on. And meanwhile, classicists and classical archaeologists were still trying to figure out what the heck to do with the Mycenaean stuff. Right? That had first blown the kind of bottom off Greek history, and now we have the Minoan stuff, how to make sense of it all. And there's a whole number of theories. I don't have time to get into them today, but some were that, the Mycenaean palaces were Near Eastern, maybe Phoenician. There were others who thought, well, they must be pick one, Achaeans, they must be the Dorians, they must be the Pelasgians, right? Like pick any Greek race out of Greek history or the texts and plop them in and try to shoehorn them in. Of course, Schliemann himself tried to shoehorn the Mycenaeans in as, this is the age of Homer, right? But that immediately came under question. And then now we have the Minoan stuff on top of that. So how to make sense of it? Well, the most influential scheme, let's call it, was that of William Ridgway. I mean, not influential generally, but on Harrison. I should qualify that. So Harrison, Ridgway had been Harrison's professor. He was the Disney Professor of Archaeology at Cambridge, so he was well situated. And he wrote, published in, 1901, I believe, The Early Age of Greece. And this was right as Evans was getting going at Knossos, so he kind of missed the boat on the Minoan stuff, which immediately drove this into, basically everything kind of fell apart for him right after that, and he was going to publish volume 2 really quickly, and then he didn't actually ever publish it. It was published posthumously because it just required too much revision after the Minoan finds. But nonetheless, there will be some important things here for Harrison. One of the things he did was look to anthropology. And so even before the Cambridge ritualists, William Ridgway was working with anthropologists. He was actually a big supporter of anthropology as a discipline and a department at Cambridge. So he was well versed in this material. And he used anthropological parallels to try to understand prehistoric Greece. Right? So he's taking the Mycenaean evidence and trying to understand who they are. So, this is a little page here from his book. It's full of all of the different finds, and he's trying to sort it all out. His first argument is that this is not Homeric. This is not a Homeric world. And so he begins to think, well, what world could it be? So he turns to Greek history, to Herodotus in particular, who mentions this pre-classical people, pre-Ionian people in Attica called the Pelasgians. And he says, they are the Pelasgians. Those are the Mycenaeans, are the Pelasgians. And then there's a heroic age. In the heroic age, well, that's the Achaeans. Those are the Achaeans of Homer, right? And he helps cement this idea by actually comparing it to the Irish heroic age, right? Comparing the epics one for one, creating this kind of stage of evolution. And then we get the Dorians, who are the classical archaic Greeks. Right? It's not your classic Dorian invasion theory, right? It's kind of a series of invasions. Like the Achaeans come, and then the Dorians come and push the Achaeans out. Right? It's this kind of series. So the whole thing falls apart pretty quickly, but it gave Harrison a really useful framework to try to understand the history as it develops. Right? That here's this very ancient people we don't know much about, and then we have this other layer. Homer and stuff, and then another layer, that's the classical and stuff, right? And so we start thinking about this kind of palimpsest, right? This layering. And so underneath, you might have these little holdovers of this primitive religion, right? That then seep up through the next layer and up again through the next layer. And so we're getting towards her ritual theory. I'll get there in a moment, promise. Okay, so here's I wanted to show you some of Harrison, again, very excited about the archaeology. Okay. So the materials for the investigation of Mycenaean and Minoan religion as they have been brought to light in Crete came but yesterday into our hands. Right? So she kind of knows that she's not going to be able to write everything because things are changing very, very fast on the ground. Also, the study of Greek religion knows much, not only to reform in method, but to a very large, recent accession of material. Now, the reform in method she's alluding to is actually what she does with text. All right. So, back to that myth theory. Some of the loveliest stories the Greeks have left us will be seen to have taken their rise not in the poetic imagination, but in primitive, often savage, and I think always practical ritual, right? Ritual first, then mythology. Several similar theories here. So again, not her original idea, but certainly running with it. Well, if we look at this, what does that mean for myth? What does that mean for the textual evidence of antiquity? You can't access, the true religion of the Greeks through text. So that becomes part of her kind of ritual theory. And I've given you the version she puts together in her kind of first groundbreaking book from 1903, The Prolegomena to Greek Religion. And here's all those elements kind of brought together. There was a fundamental layer of primitivism in ancient Greek and Roman culture, right? That's our primitive idea. An earlier, deeper, darker, chthonic, right, of the earth, agricultural religion lingered beneath the later worship of the anthropomorphic Olympian gods. So going back, right, that palimpsest, right, we've got that kind of early Pelasgian layer, right, the Mycenaean, Minoan stuff. Then you've got another layer of the Homeric stuff there. The gods have been anthropomorphized, right? And then above that, other layers of rationality, right? And so it's that deeper, darker layer is part of what that Bronze Age can give her. So, just to go back to Humphreys for a second, I think this, the discovery of the Aegean Bronze Age actually really pushed classicists and classical archaeology to look at the anthropology and look for models to try to understand what was going on because their texts failed them there. There's very little, other than maybe some snippets of Thucydides' archaeology and Herodotus could give them to understand that earlier world. All right. Ancient Greek religion was primarily about ritual, that is about the things that you do rather than the things that are thought or are written. Ritual predates mythology/theology, which he takes largely synonymously here, in the development of religions. And ancient religion cannot be understood through mythology, or at least not through mythology alone, which means that it can't be understood through text. That's largely what she means there. So that you cannot just study mythology, you cannot just read Homer and hope to ever understand Greek religion. It's kind of a nice modern idea, right? I think most of us would understand that you need, to understand something about the ancient world, you need to have a little bit of archaeology, a little bit of text, those sorts of things balanced together. But this was actually, she's shaking things up here, right? The primacy of text is not there in Harrison. She's kind of challenging its authority. All right, so that's the background context. Let me see how I'm at. All right, I think we can do the ethnography of the winnowing fan. More pictures now. Okay, and this part's pretty neat, actually. There is problems with Harrison's work, as we'll kind of come to, but I think, this is a pretty neat solution to a kind of neat problem. So we're going to have a look at this. Where's this winnowing fan of Francis Darwin come in? What's the question anyway? All right. So the mystica vannus Iacchi is the mystical fan of Iacchus, is usually how it shows up in the translations of Virgil's Georgics. Let me actually just pop to the passage here. We don't need to go through the whole thing. I've given you this old-fashioned Greenough translation because it's from, it's kind of right around the same time, right? Lines in red are the important ones for us. So Virgil here is going through the various implements that the rustic farmer needs to do agriculture, right? The cheap wickerware of Celius old, hurdles of Arbutus, and thy mystic fan, Iacchus, right? The mystic fan of Iacchus. What on earth is a fan here in this context, right? And this supposedly was Harrison's question when she was a student. She was like, what's this fan doing here? And they're like, doesn't matter, do the subjunctives. So the question is, if we think of the word fan, right? We usually think about something that moves wind, right? You're thinking about like fanning something, right? But there is an old English word, fan, that refers to a particular agricultural implement for winnowing, right? For separating grain from the chaff. And so our question is, what is this? Why is it mystic, right? What's mystical about this, right? He's just listing, plows and stuff like that. So why is this mystic? And why does it belong to this figure called Iacchus? Now I'm going to say right here that she takes Iacchus as Bacchus. That has its whole host of problems we don't have time to get into, but she's going to take it as Bacchus and not really question that going forward. So that's what we're going to do here as we go through. So the question is, what is this fan? How is it mystical? And why does a fan meant for winnowing grain belong to the god of wine? Why isn't it belonging to Demeter or Ceres? So this is what the 1903 article is about. So the big problem here, so once we get past this kind of idea of the fan in the English translation and just accept that it's not about moving wind, so we're just going to forget that notion, right? She sets up the real problem with Servius. So Servius wrote a commentary on the Georgics. And Servius calls it a sieve associated with the threshing floor. But he also reports that it was called a lyknon in Greek. Okay. But then he also says, it's sacred to the Roman god of viticulture and fertility, often identified as Dionysus, Father Liber. And the Greeks called him Lyknites, because he was placed in one as a newborn baby. So it's used as a cradle. And then Servius says it's also sometimes used to dedicate the first fruits of the harvest. So far, if you don't know anything about fans and winnowing, you're like, yeah, sure, Servius, that's fine. But when you start thinking about how things are winnowed, which is, of course, what Harrison did, you start realizing that, wait, is that a sieve, right? Think about how that... I don't have it right here at the moment. How that old farmer was winnowing. He was kind of bouncing it off his knee. It's not acting like a sieve. A basket isn't a sieve. It's a different kind of motion. And so she has this big problem with Servius. So if the vannus is meant for winnowing grain, and it's the same thing as a Greek lyknon, we have problems. Servius is probably wrong, is what it is, right? What's he know about farming anyway? So this is a really useful little example from a Red vase here. We have winnowing fans, lykna, we'll call them, plural in Greek, and then a sieve in the middle. They're different things. So basically, Servius just kind of messed up. But it does launch you on an interesting exploration. So she's like, okay, so how's a lyknon used? So she starts looking through the evidence, and you're going to see here that Harrison is not choosy about her evidence. She is going to pluck from all over the ancient world. We're going to see, she uses material and text. Text doesn't have the primacy here. One of the things she does note is as she's going, she looks at the Virgil passage. Let me just pop up there for a sec. Right? It's a very rich passage. There's, various people have studied it. I've had a look at them. They're bringing out, this idea of the arms, the arma, right? Like it's a struggle, an armed struggle for agriculture. You have all kinds of interesting Eleusinian imagery in there. There's a lot to make of this passage. Harrison says, the only thing he tells us is it's an agricultural implement, which is interesting. It kind of shows her she's not interested in the text. Right? She's not interested in that kind of analysis. She could do it. She had the skills, but she didn't want to. And it's kind of her picking and choosing. Right? It's for Harrison, the texts are really, it's not about what's internally in Virgil, right? She wants to see the ideas of Greek religion behind Virgil, right? These references, these oblique references in the text is what she's really curious about. All right, so we see lykna as cradles, right? She cites the Homeric hymn to Hermes, right? Here we have some coinage, various gods within these winnowing baskets. More babies in baskets. She's like, okay, so it was used as a cradle, right? Servius is good on that point. We see lykna with fruits. And here we got a bunch of Hellenistic reliefs, right? With a set of kind of altars with a winnowing basket full of fruits, right? And then she's going to cite some Sophocles and some Hesychius, just plucking all over the ancient world. And when you think again about that palimpsest, the way she's thinking, you can do that because you're just diving through time, picking the things you need, right? Ooh, survivals, right? If my students did that, it wouldn't go very well. But this is her method. Right? It's probably part of the reason why some of the more philologically minded of her colleagues were less than impressed. Here's another one. This one has a phallus in it, along with the first fruits. We'll come back to that idea. And another example here. So yeah, just to get this point across, she is citing widely and broadly. Right? We go from, Homer down to late Christian authors, right? Just all over the place. And none of it is set within a time frame. You would think it would be with her interest in time and layers and holdovers, but she's not. She's, it's just contextually all pushed into this one kind of conglomerate. All right, so here's another part of the problem. Okay, so we see it as we see it as a cradle, we see it as a basket with fruits. Okay, so what's it have to do with grain? All right, this is where the ethnography element comes in. She used ethnographic examples to try to explain this, and this is kind of interesting because she's using it as evidence right alongside the text, right alongside the art. And she collects her bits of information from all kinds of people. This is a list here of people who contributed bits of this information. of course, we have Francis Darwin. We have his son, who supplies an interesting little tidbit of information. Robert Carr Bosanquet we'll have a look at in a moment, some of his contributions. But he also had his uncle from the Canary Islands send her a note, send her a letter about how they winnow and separate grain on the Canary Islands. Ridgway sends her some. An expert on Finnish agriculture provides her more information. She has a professor of Sanskrit, an anthropologist, A.C. Haddon, down here, who is actively involved in anthropological field work in the Torres Strait. So, it's quite a gathering. And it partly shows her, intellectual community and its influence, but it also is the kind of ethnography she's doing is not the kind that Haddon's doing down here, right? She's not embedded within a community learning about it, right? She's gathering little bits of information from all kinds of different people. It's again the kind of that old school maybe that Klukhun was talking about. All kinds of bits of linguistic evidence from all kinds of different places, right? So different times, different places, all smushed together into this one project. Get some sense of the idea there. This is kind of a neat one. This is something that the professor of Sanskrit pointed out to her. It's actually in a British church, and you can see these, they look like helmets, but they're upside down winnowing fans, right, all over there. All right, so that's all well and good. We've kind of established that there's all kinds of information about winnowing that you can get from ethnographic tidbits. Well, part of the problem now is it a sieve? Is it a fan? How does this thing even work? Remember that she didn't even know what it was until Darwin came along. And so she actually watches, right? So here's our old gardener winnowing. There's some images, French images of winnowers, right? And you can see they kind of bounce it a bit off the knee. And so the idea there, it doesn't require wind. You actually don't want wind for this, but it kind of bounces to the top, right? And then the chaff bounces to the top and you can pick it out, right? And then you bounce it a bit. And apparently it was a very difficult technique that not many people knew how to do anymore. And there's a wonderful image she does bring up from Aristotle, that it's like an earthquake. Right? After it's taken place, a number of stones come up to the surface, like the things that are seethed up in a lichna, which is a wonderful image. So she learns how it works that way. But then as she's looking through the ancient evidence, there's this really curious passage in the Odyssey, and this has bugged several of my colleagues, so I kind of enjoy this bit. If you look at it here, right, look at the translation. This is from Lattimore. They know not, or basically, this is the advice given to Odysseus. They know neither red-cheeked ships nor well-shaped oars that are the wings for ships. So he has to go to a place where they don't know anything about ships, right? And when somebody meets you and says, "You have a winnowing fan on your dazzling shoulder," right then stick your well-shaped oar into the ground. Well, I'm sorry, but that does not look like an oar, right? This winnowing fan. That's because the word is up there. It's not lichna, right? It's etherologon, which means something like a chaff destroyer, destroyer of chaff. And so, by translating it as winnowing fan, you're like, who in the right mind is going to mistake a winnowing fan for an oar? Well, that's because there's all kinds of ways to winnow and different implements, which you can learn about through ethnography. These are winnowing spades and forks that were actually, the top two were discovered by Bosanquet, and this bottom one here came from Palestine, region in Palestine. So these look like oars, right? Problem solved. But kind of interesting. Bosanquet was actually one of the first to theorize that what we're seeing on the harvester vase, which had just been discovered in Agia Triada, right? That those are not weapons, but those are winnowing forks, right? If you take a look at that and take a look at the one from Palestine, it's a pretty good match. It's pretty convincing in that way. And so this stuff is interesting. Here's the Arabian Knight's Tale, the second royal mendicant. This is the little tidbit of information that Bernard Darwin gave her, that you have this ifrit, right? That he was so giant, his hands were like winnowing forks. Right? Again, so winnowing forks. So she finds a whole bunch of other ancient winnowing instruments mentioned in the ancient evidence. We don't need to dwell on that. And she determines that there are actually 3 ways to winnow: shake it with a winnowing basket or fan, throw it in the air using a shovel or a forked spade, or here you have, this is the sieve here. These are the Finnish winnowing instruments, which is the only example she has of one people using all 3 methods at once. Okay, so what's all this mean, right? Winnowing stuff. And what's it got to do with her ethnography and anthropology? Well, sometimes when we look at the ritualists, we think that they're kind of unique in this embrace of ethnography and anthropology and in various models. But they weren't. There's actually many who were engaging in this kind of ethnographic gathering, right? And it is very much gathering bits and pieces. It's not like the work of Boas or Malinowski, who in this same period were developing intensive fieldwork techniques where you live within a community, you participate and observe. It's a very different kind of gathering. These are 2 images here of a really great description of some of this activity from the BSA archive stories. So there's an interesting blog entry there where we can see that early archaeologists, Dawkins, for example, Toynbee, who you might recognize his name, that they were traveling around the Greek landscape and documenting modern Greek life and trying to use that in turn to understand something about Greek religion. So the ritualists were not alone in this. Here we can see an article from Wace and one from Dawkins where they're using Northern Greek carnival plays to try to understand the worship of Dionysus in antiquity. And they're gathering the same sorts of little tidbits of information. Partly also, we see this guy all the time, Bosanquet again, they keep referencing him because, when he was in Crete, he saw this certain thing happening. And then they report it in their own writing. So very much the same style as Harrison. I did want to talk a little bit more about Bosanquet in this context. I was very lucky to be given permission to have a look at his notebooks from his time in Crete because I really wanted to see if there was some mention of his winnowing forks in there. Unfortunately, there wasn't, but what I did find in his notebooks from 1900 and 1901, right when he was beginning to excavate on Crete, in 1900 he's documenting his travels through the landscape and through the villages, and he's documenting who he's talking to and why he's talking to them and who's the important man in the village and how should I greet somebody, what are the Greek words for weaving implements, and how are they making their money in this region, what's the main industry, right? How's pottery being made? Who's married to who, right? What's that festival look like? Why do the women wear that amulet when they're breastfeeding, right? He's noticing all these things and he's collecting some bits. Unfortunately, I didn't see him collecting the forks, but he was collecting amulets, right? So he was gathering these bits of data. And part of this is an interest. It's a genuine interest on his part, but part of it is also getting ready to excavate, right? You're going to need the participation of the local community. You're going to need workers. You're going to need hospitality. Whose house are you going to stay at? How are you going to treat them? And who's the guy to really talk to? Who's really in charge in the community versus kind of these other layers of government. And so it's a really fascinating document, I think, to understand that blend of ethnography and ethnographic collecting of information with the beginnings of archaeology. So I was very, very grateful to have a look at those. Just yesterday, I had a chance to look at those. Bosanquet's letters, which were collected and published by his wife, reveal a similar sort of interest in the various festivals. He took photographs, so we can see that in his work. All right, and he, of course, was a major source for Harrison in understanding the vannus. All right, I should begin to wrap things up, I think. Okay, I will wrap things up. I have so much material on this, so I am just bouncing across the surface. Okay, so just to finish off here, so I don't leave you hanging with the story of the vannus. Why is it mystical, and why does it belong to Bacchus? Well, this all ties into Harrison's ritualism and that palimpsest I was talking about, those primitive layers and holdovers. So why is the vannus mystic? It's mystic in two ways. One is as an instrument of mystical purification. So it's an object used in ritual, right, to purify. So it's not a symbol, but it is the actual vehicle of purification, in the same way that grain gets separated from the unwanted chaff, right? You get the idea of being purified from the things that you don't want. And here, for example, we can see one being held over an initiate in the Eleusinian mysteries. It's also mystic because it's a symbol promoting fertility. So this is why we see babies in Lichna. This is why we have Lichna with the first fruits. We have Lichna here in wedding processions. Nielsen criticizes this interpretation. He's just like, they just needed Lichna. They just wanted to separate their grain. And I don't know about Nielsen's a bit, sometimes just really literal in a sort of way. It's charming. But I don't know why any newlywed couple would need two of them. So I'm not sure that kind of instrumental interpretation works. But for Harrison, it's about fertility, right? That's why you see them in a wedding procession. And this is sympathetic magic. So I wanted to bring this up because these are elements she's pulling directly out of anthropological studies of primitive religion, right? Animism. Right? These are the terms used in anthropology to understand how magic works and magical thinking works. And finally, why does it belong to Bacchus and not Ceres? Well, so again, we have the association with Dionysus Lycnites. We have various imagery that suggest Bacchic worship. If you think about it like this, we go from a winnowing fan for grain to a basket holding fruit, right? It's like they've gotten confused somewhere along the way from the early primitive to the later periods, right? So remember that earlier layer of primitive, right? Where they understood that it was about grain. Now we're in a later period where they've forgotten why they're doing things, but they're filling it with fruit. And when they fill it with fruit, there's also a phallus sometimes. And so with the phallus, right, Dionysus and phallic worship, bring it all together. Think about Dionysus or Bacchus as a god from Thrace, who was the god of beer initially, grain, right? And then he comes down, quite literally, into Greece, and we see a shift from the worship of Demeter as an earth mother to Dionysus, the male beer god and wine god. This part is not very convincing. Right? This is the sort of stuff that where we really see her technique and her method fall apart. But I'm hoping you can see in that the idea of the progression, right, from primitive layers up through. And Demeter herself is the anthropomorphized version of an earth goddess, right, the earth mother goddess. So, yeah. Earlier, deeper, darker, chthonic agricultural religion, where the vannus is a fan for separating grain, and then you have the anthropomorphized gods. Okay, back to my main question. Thank you for hanging in there. The mulled wine is coming. All right, so I promised you a little bit of the criticisms of ritualism. This poor guy, Foray, nobody ever cites him except for this. He's kind of blowing his top over ritualism. Right? As the irrational, semi-sentimental Polynesian free verse and sex freedom Hellenism of all the gushful geysers of rapturous rubbish about the Greek spirit. He pretty much has a meltdown over it. And so you do get that kind of reaction, which is pretty knee-jerk, and it's, now we kind of giggle at it. It's, he believed in the serene rationality of antiquity. But not everybody was quite so unhinged or had problems with that. They had problems with the methods. Gardner, for example, in an otherwise very polemical review, says that Harrison starts with some wild theory and then twists all facts to adapt to it. Yeah, he says it pretty polemically, but he's not wrong. Okay? Kirk, writing in 1970, much later, Harrison was following the model of Fraser, tossed in catalogues of vague similarities drawn from a dozen different cultures in apparent support of a highly dubious theory. All right, so there's some problems with the method, let's say. So let's ignore Foray and his temper tantrum and focus on this kind of method thing. So, oh man, I'm ending with isms. I apologize. Okay. I think we need to understand the ritualists and the split with anthropology and their role in it in a much broader historical context. Finley is surprisingly focused on individuals for someone who claims they were really into social science models. So I think we need to think a little bit more broadly. And Humphreys doesn't seem quite right in pinning the different the divergence down to new data. So a couple of ideas to think about. What was happening around 1900 and moving in through the 20s is a kind of a movement towards particularism, right? This just means being really focused on historically things happening, right? That's really what it means. And it really does imply a focusing in. We also get the rise of scientific positivism, right? That it's just better to be in science. That is how you truly understand things. That is where true understanding comes from. Well, that has a split, right? So in anthropology, they begin to treat themselves as a social science, emphasis on science, which means divorcing from the past, especially that comparative evolutionary past. And the break in anthropology is very dramatic. Within a period of about 10 years, almost all comparative evolutionary studies disappear out of anthropology, or they're really driven to the edges, to the margins. Instead, there's this passion for field work in individual communities, intensive living for years at a time in a community and understanding them, trying to understand them as much in their own terms. This was certainly not a perfect method. It has all kinds of problems, but don't have time for that. And when anthropology began to compare again, it compared patterns, right? Like we had with Kluckhohn at the beginning there. So comparing patterns, models, ideas, ideal types. Classics, meanwhile, was already pretty historically particularist. The best way to understand the Greeks and Romans is through the Greeks and Romans. Right? That's kind of the idea there. Still interested in evolution and simple comparative ethnography far too long, I'd argue all the way up into the 80s. I've seen that in my own work on development of Greek kinship and states. And especially that classics was not a science, and it never claimed to be, right? You can see that in the development of classical archaeology, how long it took to come around to the idea of it as a science, but as part of the humanities. And so it never had those pretensions towards scientific positivism. Okay, this is my last slide. Thank you for hanging in with me. My assessment in the light of those kind of two intellectual movements is that the ritualists are a symptom. They're not a cause, right? They're a symptom of the changing, anthropological environment in particular, right? That move towards field work didn't leave much room for the classics. And to try to do that kind of field work with classical tradition, that's exceedingly difficult, and it wouldn't really be attempted until Finley comes along, and there's issues with that in the 1950s. And that's the subject of my next chapter, is on that. All right, well, thank you very much for hanging with me.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I'm sure there must be questions and comments. If you have one, raise your hand. I'll get the microphone to you so that those who are following online can hear you.
Well, it was a wonderful speech, and I think that was a great chance to recognize how much we owe as classics and scholars to the roads, the highways that were opened by Fraser and, of course, Harrison. However, as a postscriptum, would you mind offering us, since you mentioned the criticism at the end, any worth mentioned criticism on behalf of the opposite side, and by that I mean the Berkeley guys and the French, from the 70s, the 80s, yes. Perhaps until the very late Seaford.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, the French, that's the subject of my third chapter. So I haven't totally delved in there yet, but it is rather interesting. I've been looking at an article of Détienne, who is pretty harsh, kind of like Finley is towards the ritualists and Harrison. And of course we know that, and I think we have to look at the development of French structuralism, for example, in this light, because when you think about the comparison of patterns, really that's what structuralism is, right? And a big part of the problem with what the ritualists were doing, and others of the time, Ridgway and Fraser, was they were taking one element from Humphreys has a great example. I'll draw on that if you look at how rain rituals are done amongst the Bongo, and then you look at how they're done amongst the Greeks, and you're like, whoa, there's a similarity. Well, then they must be the same sorts of people living in the same sorts of ways. It's a very simplistic way of comparing. And I think what we begin to see in the 50s with picking up with people like Finley and others, Donlan, that they'll begin to look at more modern archaeology and look at models and typologies and try to apply those with varying amounts of success. What the French do with Lévi-Strauss is really on a whole other level, I think, of complexity, of developing a pattern and then seeing that pattern across the world even, right, that universalism. So I think this is one of the reasons why I'm focusing in on those elements, is because I feel in many ways they are an answer to that, and they are really important meeting points, I think, between classics and anthropology. So I hope that sort of answers your question. Okay, it's a big one. There's a great range of response to the ritualists, and you could just go into the Blagan and pull out books on myth, and it's like, boo. Yeah, it's been fun. Yeah. Maybe when I come back, I'll talk about French structuralism, or maybe not.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. Just a point of interest, in modern Greek, lichnizo means winnowing.
Yes.
And from lignon. So you can see the connection between the ancient Greek word for winnow and the modern Greek word, which it's done with a fork, and they put the fork up in the air, so the good stuff stays on top, and the bad stuff, just the wind takes away.
Right.
Lichnizo, that's the
Lichnizo. Wonderful. And I think that's That's partly why I love this article, is because this is a place where like the ethnography of the instrument works for me, right? I think she has an elegant solution to this, and I think here the ethnographic information that Bosanquet found those kinds of forks, and he talked to a farmer from Crete about them, and that really, like, yeah, that's a really useful illustration. Right? And it is this wonderful, wonderful carryover and examples. This brings me to another point that, you have, when you do comparison, right, there's these little bits that help illuminate something for you. So I love to make comparisons and analogies and teaching and all, and, that's really useful to help understand a concept. And so by looking at modern winnowing techniques in Greece and seeing that connection, you can be like, now I kind of understand this thing about antiquity. What it doesn't let me understand is how a whole society works. And that's where they got confused. The difference between, that's an enlightening little bit of information that's really useful, versus, now we can characterize a whole society by it. And I think that's where Fraser and Harrison often went wrong, that if she had stopped at the vannus, what is it, be great. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Any more? You all want? If there are no more questions and comments, come along next door and have a glass of wine. Thank you very much, Emily, once again.
Thank you.